This is, just make sure you're in the right place. This is a public training on the 2018 amended statewide industrial stormwater general permit. Hopefully you got your coffee, and thank you for coming today and participating on the webcast. I'm going to go through the time frame of the day, some housekeeping rules, the evacuation procedures in general, and then I'll introduce the speakers. So we're going to go through those protocols. We'll go through the amended permit, so what was changed in 2018, which includes sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods, total maximum daily loads. We'll do a break in questions, and then I'll go through the industrial stormwater permit mapping tool, the permit compliance options, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. Please make sure your phones are on silent or at least vibrate, because it is webcast, people could hear that. We will be either sending a mic around or having you come up and speak at the dais if you have questions so people on the web can hear you. And then I'm Laurel Wardrop. I'm the Industrial and Construction Stormwater Unit Chief here at the State Water Board. This is Pushpa Zachariah. She's a Water Resource Control Engineer, and she's the Industrial Stormwater Permit Lead in that unit. If there's an emergency, don't stay here. I want you to get out of the doors and then go down the stairs and exit through the front doors into Cesar Chavez Park. Do not use any elevators, they will be disabled, and you obviously don't want to go up in an emergency, you want to go down, so please use the stairs. If you have any disabilities or challenges with walking downstairs, please let us know and we'll escort you and find the proper people to help you out. Okay.
Thank you, Laurel. So I will first go over an overview of the amended permit. So the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Statewide Industrial General Stormwater Permit is a federally mandated regulation which is implemented by the State Water Resources Control Board, State Water Board for short, and the Regional Water Quality Control Boards, Regional Water Boards for short. The permit regulates stormwater discharges associated with industrial activities that may discharge to waters of the United States, and this was adopted in 2014. On November 6, 2018, the State Water Board adopted an amendment to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, Statewide General Permit, Stormwater Permit, which I will be calling permit for short from now on. The new requirements for this amended permit become effective on July 1st, 2020. The Industrial General Stormwater Permit that was adopted in 2014 is currently still in effect until that date. The new requirements that become effective on July 1st, 2020 include sufficiently sensitive analytical test method implementation requirements, the applicability of total maximum daily loads to industrial stormwater discharges, total maximum daily load implementation requirements found in Attachment E of the amended permit, and the compliance options to incentivize stormwater capture and use, which are found in Attachment I of the amended permit. The first new implementation requirement we will be going over is sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods. Federal regulations require National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, NPDES permits for short, to specify the use of standard analytical methods for water quality analysis. These federal requirements can be found in 40 Code of Regulation, CFR for short, Part 122.44 I-14, which specify monitoring requirements. Approved standard analytical methods can be found in 40 CFR Part 136. What are the requirements for sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods? These federal requirements require that analytical test methods used to assure compliance with numeric requirements have a minimum level of quantitation at or below the water quality criteria or numeric requirement for the measured pollutant or pollutant parameter. These federal requirements apply to all dischargers with NPDES permit coverage. For the purposes of understanding reporting terms when talking about sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods, there are a few key terms to note. The minimum level of quantitation is also referred to as the method minimum level or reporting limit in this permit. The method detection limit is also another term to note. We will also refer to water quality criterion or criteria in the permit as numeric requirement. So, how does sufficiently sensitive test methods apply in the permit? The permit requires the analytical test methods used for water quality analysis to be sufficiently sensitive enough to quantify pollutants at or below the numeric requirement. The numeric requirements are quantified as numeric action levels, also known as NALs, Tmdl numeric action levels, also known as TNALs, and numeric effluent limitations, also known as NELs.
And a little, you guys might also know about the effluent limitation guidelines. If you had numerics in those, that would also apply, but it's less of the focus today.
These requirements apply to all dischargers that are subject to monitoring, sampling, and reporting requirements. What does it mean for an analytical method to be sufficiently sensitive? A method is considered sufficiently sensitive if the method minimum level, which is seen as the reporting limit here, is at or below the level of applicable water quality criterion, which is in the form of an NAL here, for the measured pollutant or pollutant parameter. Or a method is considered sufficiently sensitive if the method has the lowest minimum level of the analytical methods approved under 40 CFR Part 136 or required under 40 CFR Chapter I, Subchapter N or O for the measured pollutant or pollutant parameter. When analytical lab results from qualifying storm events are reported to the State Water Board, it should be submitted through ad hoc monitoring reports in the Stormwater Multiple Application and Report Tracking System, also known as SMARTS, as stated in Section 11B of the permit. Analytical data in ad hoc monitoring reports is compliant when the reporting limit is at or under the applicable numeric requirement and when the method detection limit is under the reporting limit and the applicable numeric requirement. The reporting limit and the method detection limit both need to be reported when entering ad hoc monitoring reports. We will go over two examples of when an analytical test method is considered to be sufficiently sensitive and when it is not.
So for implementation, in SMARTS, you won't see much of a difference other than the concept of entering your reporting limit and method detection limit will be mandatory fields.
So the first example shows the numeric requirement, the reporting limit, and the method detection limit for this analytical method used for this pollutant parameter. The numeric requirement for this pollutant parameter is a numeric action level of 15 milligrams per liter. The laboratory used an analytical method that shows a reporting limit of 5 milligrams per liter and a method detection limit of 1 milligram per liter. Because the method detection limit and the reporting limit are below the numeric requirement, this analytical method is considered to be sufficiently sensitive. The second example shows for this analytical method the same numeric requirement, which is a numeric action level of 15 milligrams per liter, but a different reporting limit, reporting at 50 milligrams per liter, and a method detection limit at 20 milligrams per liter. These are above the applicable numeric requirement, so this analytical method is not considered to be sufficiently sensitive. In order for a discharger to correctly follow these requirements, it is important that they use an analytical laboratory that can perform the sufficiently sensitive analytical methods found in 40 CFR Part 136 for the particular pollutant parameters their facility needs to assess. Here are some criteria to use to find analytical laboratories that meet these requirements. First, you want to ensure that the analytical lab is accredited by the State Water Board's Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, ELAP for short, to use methods to analyze samples for the permit. Second, you want to ensure that the lab uses United States Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA for short, approved test methods found from 40 CFR Part 136. Third, you want to ensure that the approved test methods used at the lab are sufficiently sensitive to meet the applicable numeric requirements for the pollutants being tested. Note that the test methods in 40 CFR Part 136 get updated regularly, and that not all methods found in 40 CFR Part 136 are sufficiently sensitive. So it is imperative to check that the test methods used are sufficiently sensitive to meet the parameters' numeric requirements. Are there any questions about sufficiently sensitive test methods? Okay.
No questions?
Thank you. All right, so now we'll be going into the implementation of total maximum daily loads, TMDLs for short. So just to give you a breakdown of what I'll be going over, first we'll go through an overview of the TMDL implementation, and then we will go over the applicability of TMDLs, their timing requirements, numeric requirements, and then the reporting requirements. So, what is a total maximum daily load? A total maximum daily load is also known as a TMDL, is a regulatory tool that identifies the maximum amount of pollutant from potential sources in the watershed that a water body can receive while attaining water quality standards. A TMDL is a plan that identifies and calculates the total amount of loads of a single pollutant from all contributing sources that is allowed to discharge into the water body in order to meet the water quality standards. Contributing sources include point sources and non-point sources. Point sources incorporated into the TMDL are assigned a waste load allocation. Since industrial stormwater is considered a point source, we will be focusing on assigned waste load allocations from here on out. How are these TMDLs developed? A list of water bodies that are impaired due to identified pollutants causing the impairment is developed. This list is known as the Clean Water Act 303D impairment list. One way to address the impairments to these water bodies is through the development of TMDLs. The TMDLs are developed by the US EPA or the Regional Water Quality Control Board, also known as the Regional Water Boards. The state also develops statewide policies to address these impairments. When a TMDL is being developed, it goes through its own separate public comment period and adoption process. Adopted TMDLs are incorporated into the Regional Water Board's basin plans. They are then incorporated and implemented by required permits like the Industrial Stormwater General Permit. Federal regulations require these permits to Federal regulations require these permits to implement applicable TMDLs. Once a TMDL is adopted, it cannot be changed during the implementation process. So how did it become a part of this permit? On April 1st, 2014, the current permit was adopted by the State Water Board. The current version of the permit does contain in Attachment E the TMDLs that identify industrial stormwater as a source and were adopted by the regional water boards and the US EPA. In the current version of the permit, there is a clause that allowed for the permit to be reopened and amended to incorporate the TMDL implementation requirements for the TMDLs included in Attachment E. From 2016 to 2018, the amendment reopener went through a regional and state water board public comment period and process. focused stakeholder outreach was also included during this time. On November 6, 2018, the State Water Board amended the permit to require the new Tmdl implementation requirements. On July 1st, 2020, the amended requirements of the permit go into effect.
I just wanted to make sure you guys heard what Pushpa said, is that when a TMDL is adopted by the US EPA and the regional board, that goes into the basin plan for that region. So it's a basin plan amendment, meaning that to change how those requirements apply, you'd have to change the basin plan. From that, it's then required to be implemented. Once that's in regulation, we have to implement those requirements into these NPDES permits.
So now we will go over how the Tmdl implementation requirements from the permit are applicable. Approved Tmdls that are applicable to the industrial stormwater discharges are found in Attachment E of the amended permit. In Attachment E, you will find a list of applicable Tmdls found in Table E1 and a table of Tmdl-specific permit requirements found in Table E2. Section 2F of the fact sheet of the amended permit also provides extensive information on Tmdl-specific permit requirements. In Table E2 of Attachment E, the Tmdls are organized by regional water boards. Table E2 identifies implementation and compliance information for each column. Note that this table is a really important part of identifying Tmdl applicability for a discharger. The columns identify, 1, the name of the US EPA approved Tmdl, 2, the Tmdl impaired water bodies or watersheds and tributaries, 3, the pollutant or pollutants that are causing the impairment, 4, the applicable additional Tmdl numeric requirements assigned to that pollutant, generally a concentration limit, 5, the required compliance actions, and 6, the due date for compliance, which is the date when the requirements go into effect. So there are 36 Tmdls that have been translated into the permit. They are within the following regional water boards. San Francisco Bay has 3 applicable Tmdls, Los Angeles has 25 applicable Tmdls, Santa Ana has 1 applicable TMDL, and San Diego has 7 applicable TMDLs.
And so what you see on this slide is on the lower, the smaller image is the San Francisco Bay, and that's the Sonoma Creek and Napa River watershed TMDLs. You don't see the third one on there because it's related to solely one mine in Region 2, but if you've heard of it, it's just, we acknowledge it in this permit. And then the green watershed in the bigger image is the Los Angeles River watershed, or LA Regional Board watersheds. It's almost all related to one or more TMDLs. The pink one is the Santa Ana region, and then the orange one is the San Diego region.
The Tmdls identifying waste load allocations attributable to industrial stormwater sources were translated from the Regional Water Board basin plans into the amended permit as Tmdl numeric action levels, called TNALs, numeric effluent limitations, called NELs, or none. For none, no additional requirements were added to the pollutant parameter. Dischargers must comply with applicable Tmdl-specific requirements in addition to all other applicable provisions of the permit.
And so right before we started the broadcast, we were getting a few questions about how the board determined the translation. So I'll go over that briefly on this slide. So when the TMDL was translated into a TMDL action level, this is because the TMDL acknowledged that industrial stormwater is a source, but the way that the waste load allocation in that TMDL was structured was less specific to implementation. So we had a little more discretion to fit those requirements from the TMDL into this permit. So we translated those into TMDL-specific action levels, which are representative of the waste load allocations. An example of this is maybe they assigned all NPDES permits a waste allocation, so it would apply individually, but it wasn't specific to industrial stormwater to where you'd have a numeric effluent limit. When we translated a TMDL into a numeric effluent limit, this is because the TMDL specifically had a concentration-based limit that applied to industrial stormwater effluent, and the point of compliance is at the point of discharge. So it's a very specific requirement in the TMDL, and these are mainly in the Los Angeles region and the Santa Ana region. Well, they are right now in those two regions. And then the none is because they said stormwater from industrial activities is a source, but the allocation was less specific. Or they said, you can comply with this TMDL through this permit without additional requirements. So we'll take questions at the end. Please don't lose that question. We'll take questions at the end of the TMDL segment. Absolutely. Please don't lose the question.
So, dischargers must comply with all applicable TMDL specific requirements in addition to all other applicable provisions of the permit. Dischargers that must comply with applicable TMDL specific permit requirements are called responsible dischargers. A responsible discharger is defined in the permit as a discharger with notice of intent coverage under this general permit who discharges stormwater associated with industrial activities and authorized non-stormwater discharges, either directly or through a municipal separate storm sewer system called an MS4, to impaired water bodies identified in a US EPA-approved TMDL with a waste load allocation assigned to industrial stormwater sources. Note that TMDL-specific permit requirements do not apply to dischargers with no exposure certification coverage or a facility complying with notice of non-applicability criteria. Dischargers with notice of intent coverage in the San Francisco Bay, Los Angeles, Santa Ana, or San Diego regional water boards need to determine if they are a responsible discharger and see if the TMDL specific requirements are applicable to them. First, they would need to identify if the facility has active notice of intent coverage under the permit. Then, they would need to identify if the receiving water body or watershed that the facility discharges to meets the definition of a responsible discharger. If they have identified that their receiving water body or bodies or watershed have TMDL-specific requirements, they would then need to figure out through a pollutant source assessment if there are TMDL-specific pollutants in the industrial stormwater discharging from the facility. Once they have identified that there are TMDL-specific pollutants in their industrial stormwater, they would have determined that they are a responsible discharger. They would then need to identify the TMDL-specific actions that are applicable from Table E2 of Attachment E of the permit. We will go over in a little more detail how to determine if TMDL-specific permit requirements are applicable to a discharger by determining if they are a responsible discharger. The first step in figuring out if a discharger is a responsible discharger and that TMDL-specific permit requirements apply to them would be to determine if a discharger has active notice of intent coverage under the permit. After a discharger has determined that they have notice of intent coverage under the permit, they would need to determine the receiving water body or water bodies in which their facility discharges to. In identifying the water bodies, the discharger should also identify the watershed the facility is in, and if the receiving water body is tributary to a larger watershed system, for example, an unnamed urban creek. It is recommended that a discharger also identify the entire watershed because Table E2 identifies the specific watershed, the water body and its tributaries, and the water body, and its associated TMDL-specific permit requirements. It is essential they know that the facility's receiving water body or water bodies and the associated watersheds to ensure that a responsible discharger is complying with the correct TMDL specific permit requirements. The terminology used in the impaired water body watershed column in Table E2 is either a watershed, a water body and its tributaries, or a water body. Watershed refers to discharges into any receiving waters within the identified watershed. The water body and tributaries refers to discharges into any receiving water within the watershed that leads to the identified water body. The water body and tributaries definition is the same as the watershed definition, but the use of the two terms in Table E2 has been used to be consistent with the terminology used in the TMDL itself. The named water body refers to discharges only to the identified receiving water body. Once a discharger has determined that their receiving water body has been identified in Table E2 of Attachment E, they will need to continue to determine TMDL applicability by reviewing the facility's pollutant source assessment to ensure all industrial materials handled at the facility are listed and all pollutants exposed to stormwater with the potential to discharge from the facility are identified. The pollutants column lists the pollutant that is impairing the water body or watershed listed in the water body watershed column. These pollutants were identified and assigned industrial stormwater waste load allocations in the TMDL. However, a responsible discharger is only required to sample for these pollutants if it is present in their facility's industrial stormwater discharges. Therefore, for many dischargers identifying as responsible dischargers, the sampling parameters in their monitoring programs have already been identified and will not change as a result of the new TMDL requirements. However, dischargers with current sampling parameters for pollutants identified in an applicable TMDL will be subject to the new TMDL permit requirements. So, when a discharger has met the criteria in steps 1 through 3, they are considered to be a responsible discharger. There are expectations of a responsible discharger once they determine that TMDL-specific permit requirements apply to them. When a discharger has determined that they are a responsible discharger, to help them comply with the implementation requirements in the permit, they need to, at minimum, implement best management practices, also known as BMPs, to reduce or prevent the pollutant discharge. They need to develop and implement a monitoring implementation plan. They need to conduct sampling and analysis for all applicable parameters, which include parameters identified from the pollutant source assessment or required by the permit. And they need to develop and implement an updated stormwater pollution prevention plan, also known as a SWRCB. The requirements for TMDL numeric action levels and numeric effluent limitation compliance is integrated into the permit and is organized so all dischargers who are responsible dischargers and discharging TMDL-related industrial pollutants can easily navigate through the permit to identify sampling, monitoring, and reporting requirements. Now, let's go over a couple of examples of how to determine the applicability of TMDL-specific permit requirements for a facility using Table E2. In the first example, we will look at the Napa River Sediment TMDL, which is highlighted with the red box on this slide. The Napa River Sediment TMDL applies to the discharger if, 1, they have notice of intent coverage, 2, the facility's receiving water is identified as the Napa River or any water body that is a tributary to Napa River, because the impaired water body watershed column lists the Napa River watershed. Remember, this watershed naming convention refers to any discharge going directly or through an MS4 into the watershed of that water body. And 3, the discharger's facility has identified sediment in their pollutant source assessment and industrial stormwater discharge, which in this case would be every discharger, since total suspended solids is a mandatory monitoring parameter in the permit. They have determined that they are a responsible discharger and need to comply with Tmdl specific requirements of the Napa River Sediment Tmdl. In the next example, we will look at Bayona Creek Metals Tmdl. This Tmdl applies to the discharger if 1, they have active notice of intent coverage, and 2, if the facilities receiving water is identified as Bayona Creek or Sepulveda Canyon Channel. Remember, this water body naming convention refers to any discharges directly or through an MS4 that are solely discharging to the identified water body, which are either Bayona Creek or Sepulveda Canyon Channel. And 3, if the discharger's facility has identified copper, lead, and/or zinc in their pollutant source assessment and industrial stormwater discharge. They have determined that they are a responsible discharger and need to comply with Tmdl specific requirements of the Bayona Creek Metals Tmdl. So now that we have established how to determine if a Tmdl applies to a discharger, we can now talk about Tmdl timing requirements. As mentioned earlier, the State Water Board adopted the amended permit with an effective date of July 1st, 2020, which means none of the new requirements go into effect until this date. Each Tmdl specific requirement identified in Table E2 of Attachment E has a compliance due date, which refers to the date the Tmdl specific requirements go into effect. If the compliance due date is listed as July 1st, 2020, that means the requirements are effective upon July 1st, 2020. If the compliance due date has already passed, the effective date is July 1st, 2020. If the compliance due date is listed as a date after July 1st, 2020, that means that the requirements are effective upon that specified future date of the Tmdl itself. The additional Tmdl-related numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation column, which I will continue to refer to as the additional Tmdl numeric requirements column, provides you with the waste load allocation attributable to industrial stormwater sources, generally in the form of a concentration. As mentioned before, they were translated into TNALs, NELs, or none. In this column, additional information may be provided, such as if it is an interim or final requirement.
An interim is when the Tmdl itself set those requirements, so they have a long-term final effective date of the Tmdl requirements, so they put these interim numbers or requirements in the Tmdl, so that's the difference. A final, and sometimes a Tmdl didn't have both, it had just a final.
So the required actions column gives additional directions on how to comply with the permit. These requirements become effective on the compliance due date. In Table E2 of Attachment E, the compliance due date indicates the date when the additional Tmdl numeric requirements and required actions of a pollutant go into effect for a specified Tmdl. For instance, if a responsible discharger has established that Bayona Creek Metals Tmdl is applicable to their facility because they discharge copper, lead, and/or zinc directly or through an MS4 to Bayona Creek or Sepulveda Canyon Channel, they would need to find the applicable additional Tmdl-related requirements in the fourth column. The Tmdl numeric requirements found in this Tmdl state copper has an NEL of 0.0137 milligrams per liter, lead has an NEL of 0.07675 milligrams per liter, and zinc has an NEL of 0.10477 milligrams per liter. And they would also need to find out how to comply with requirements of the Tmdl, which is found in the fifth column, required actions. And then they would need to find out what the compliance due date is, which for this TMDL is July 1st, 2020. In the additional TMDL numeric requirements column, some waste load allocation translations have an interim target. All interim targets found in Table E2 are Tmdl concentrations. The compliance due dates apply the same as previously explained. If a pollutant in a TMDL is assigned an interim target, note that there will also be an assigned final target to comply with for the same TMDL at a future date. In this example, the compliance due date of July 1st, 2020 is when the interim Tmdl copper and lead concentration requirements are in effect and should be applied. A responsible discharger will have to comply with the required actions of this interim target until the date of the final target.
And so what will happen is this permit will eventually reissue it, and if the final date hasn't passed yet, that interim will still stand in the reissued permit. But then say it said a final date of 2035, whatever the reissuance cycle is of this permit at that time would probably have to put in the final requirement. So it goes through the permit cycle. I also wanted to make sure that you guys understood the idea of a compliance date. So on or after July 1st of 2020, all sampling that is required to apply with one or more of these TMDLs will be compared to those applicable concentrations. So you don't have to comply by July 1st of 2020. And I know Push Plus said that, but it's an important point.
So a final target of a pollutant of a TMDL can be assigned a Tmdl or an NEL concentration. These will replace the associated interim target concentration and will have a different compliance date. Here, we see the final target from the previous interim target requirement example. This shows that the final targets have NEL copper and lead requirements and have a compliance due date of May 5th, 2032. A responsible discharger required to comply with the interim Tmdl copper and/or lead requirements upon July 1st, 2020 will replace those requirements with the final NEL copper and lead requirements on May 5th, 2032. Additional TMDL numeric requirements are only replaced by a final target when an interim target is in place. Whether a responsible discharger is complying with the interim Tmdl copper and lead requirements or the final NEL copper and lead requirements, a responsible discharger is still required to concurrently comply with the NAL requirements from Table 2, which will be discussed next. Finding 45 of the permit states that the NALs found in Table 2 shall continue to apply to responsible dischargers in addition to any applicable Tmdls and NELs found in Table E2 of Attachment E. Responsible dischargers must continue to comply with their applicable NAL requirements. This means that an applicable Tmdl or NEL pollutant value does not replace the NAL value, but applies concurrently and in addition to NAL values for the same pollutant. So we will go over a couple of examples to determine if a TMDL is applicable, and if it is applicable, we want to determine when it will go into effect. In this first scenario, a discharger with notice of intent coverage has a facility in the Los Angeles region. The facility identified their receiving water to be Marina del Rey Harbor. The facility identifies from their pollutant source assessment that a copper is a pollutant that can be found in the industrial stormwater discharge. So, first, we will determine if the discharger is a responsible discharger, looking at Table E2. So, we have established that the discharger has active notice of intent coverage. So we will look at Table E2. We know that the discharger's facility discharges directly to Marina del Rey Harbor, which is identified in Table E2. Copper is an identified industrial pollutant in the pollutants category of Table E2. Therefore, the Tmdl is applicable and the discharger is a responsible discharger. So now we want to determine when the Tmdl will go into effect. So we look at the compliance due date column and we see that the Tmdl goes into effect on July 1st, 2020. Looking at the additional Tmdl numeric requirements, we see there are no additional numeric requirements related to this Tmdl. The required actions specify that there are no additional requirements and that the responsible discharger will need to continue to comply with the permit. In the second scenario, a discharger with notice of intent coverage has a facility in the San Diego region. The facility identified their receiving water as Choyas Creek. The facility identifies from their pollutant source assessment that zinc is a pollutant that can be found in their industrial stormwater discharge. So first, we will determine if the discharger is a responsible discharger looking at Table E2. So we have established that the discharger has active notice of intent coverage. The discharger's facility discharges directly to Choyas Creek. We can identify Choyas Creek as an impaired water body in Table E2. Zinc is an identified industrial pollutant in the pollutants column of Table E2. Therefore, the Tmdl is applicable and the discharger is a responsible discharger. So now we want to determine when the Tmdl will go into effect. So we look at the compliance due date column and we see that the Tmdl goes into effect on July 1st, 2020. Looking at the additional Tmdl numeric requirements, we see that there is an interim Tnal requirement for zinc of 0.175 milligrams per liter related to this Tmdl. The required actions specify that in addition to complying with the permit, sampling results will also need to be compared to the Tnal concentration and sampling collection, and reporting need to be conducted in accordance with the sampling and analysis requirements found in Section 11B of the permit. The responsible discharger will need to comply with these requirements starting July 1st, 2020.
And we haven't changed Section 11B. It's the existing requirement since 2014.
Because there is an interim target for this Tmdl pollutant, we also have to look for the final target in the Choyas Creek metal Tmdl. So, in looking for the final target, we need to find in Table E2, the same Tmdl, which is Choyas Creek metal Tmdl, the same identified water body, which is Choyas Creek, and the same pollutant, which is zinc. You will find in the additional Tmdl numeric requirements column that for zinc, the final target has an NEL of 0.175 milligrams per liter. The responsible discharger will need to comply with the new Tmdl NEL, which replaces the interim target Tnal, and will also need to comply with the directions found in the required actions column by October 22nd, 2028. So, now that we have established Tmdl applicability and their timing requirements, we can talk about the Tmdl specific numeric requirements. When reported sampling results exceed permit numeric requirements, which are NALs, TNALs, and NELs, these are what are known as exceedences. There are two types of exceedences found in this permit: annual average exceedences and instantaneous maximum exceedences. An annual average exceedance is when the annual average concentrations of all the qualifying storm event sampling analytical results for a parameter exceed the annual average value for that parameter within a reporting year. The annual average values are reported as NAL values, which can be found in Table 2 of the permit. An instantaneous maximum exceedance is when two or more analytical results from qualifying storm events taken for a parameter exceed an applicable instantaneous maximum NAL, TNAL, or NEL value for that parameter during the reporting year. All TNAL and NEL concentrations in Table E2 are an instantaneous maximum exceedance concentration. This table shows the exceedance types and the exceedance implementation requirements that are applicable to each type of numeric requirement. Most NAL pollutant exceedance types are an annual average exceedance. If an annual average or instantaneous maximum NAL is exceeded, the exceedance response action process called ERAs is implemented. All TNAL pollutant exceedance types are an instantaneous maximum exceedance. If an instantaneous maximum TNAL is exceeded, the ERA process is implemented. An NEL exceedance is different. All Tmdl-related NEL pollutant exceedance types are instantaneous maximum exceedances. An NEL is an effluent limitation, not an action level. And therefore, when an NEL is exceeded, it is a violation of the permit. Upon determination that a facility is in violation for an NEL exceedance, they must implement water quality-based corrective actions, continue to comply with any applicable NALs and ERAs, and possibly mandatory minimum penalties will apply to the NELs. It is worth briefly noting that not all NEL violations end up meeting the Clean Water Act and California Water Code definitions for mandatory minimum penalties. In summary, only NAL and TNAL exceedances go through the ERA process. There is no facility level status for a NEL exceedances because when an NEL is exceeded, it is a violation of the permit. Since a responsible discharger must now track NAL exceedances and TNAL exceedances to implement the ERA process, there is an approach to how the ERA process is implemented upon July 1st, 2020. Permit sections 12B through D define the ERA process that occurs at each level. Upon July 1st, 2020, responsible dischargers that have baseline status for a parameter NAL also have baseline status for the same parameter TNAL if there is an applicable TNAL. Upon July 1st, 2020, responsible dischargers that have level 1 status for a parameter NAL have level 1 status for the same parameter TNAL if there is an applicable TNAL. Upon July 1st, 2020, responsible dischargers that have level 2 status for a parameter NAL have level 2 status for the same parameter TNAL if there is an applicable TNAL.
So if you're so July 1st, 2020 occurs, you're in level 1 for copper, and one of these copper Tmdl requirements apply to you, you'll be in level 1 for both. We are not saying you exceeded that TNAL. We're just saying that if you're already in level 1 for copper, most of the Tmdl values are lower. So you should plan to try to comply with both instead of doing a whole other cycle of reporting and costs with a consultant. You can just streamline them together, and it's still an action level, but plan for them at the same time.
The flowchart on the left shows an example of how this occurs. On July 1st, 2020, if a facility is in level 1 for a copper NAL, and now the facility is also subject to a copper TNAL with the compliance due date of July 1st, 2020, then the facility is in level 1 for a copper TNAL and copper NAL on July 1st, 2020. So now that we know how a TNAL and NAL facility status for a parameter is applied upon the effective date, we need to understand how a facility moves forward in implementing and tracking exceedances. Responsible dischargers must track applicable exceedances concurrently for the same parameter within a reporting year. From an applicable Tmdl, they are required to track for a parameter a Tnal instantaneous maximum exceedance or an NEL instantaneous maximum exceedance, and they must also track concurrently an NAL annual average or instantaneous maximum exceedances. Responsible dischargers are required to track NAL annual average exceedances concurrently with applicable TNAL instantaneous maximum exceedances for the same parameter and implement the required ERAs. Remember, it is not a violation of the permit to exceed an NAL or a TNAL, but it is a violation to fail to implement the required ERA process. The flowchart to the left shows an example of how this occurs. For example, starting July 1st, 2020, a facility starts their reporting year at level 1 for their parameter NAL and additionally level 1 for their parameter TNAL. The facility would then track their sample's compliance with the parameter NAL concentration annual average and the parameters TNAL concentration instantaneous maximum exceedance. At the end of the reporting year, the facility met the parameter NAL concentration, but they exceeded the parameter TNAL concentration. This means the facility would be going to level 2 for the parameter due to the exceedance of the TNAL. Therefore, at the beginning of the following reporting period on July 1st, 2021, the facility will have level 2 status for the parameter. Just like NAL and TNAL tracking, responsible dischargers are required to track an applicable NAL exceedance concurrently with an applicable NEL exceedance for a pollutant. The flow chart to the left is an example that focuses on a single parameter with an NAL annual average and an NEL instantaneous maximum concentration. Starting July 1st, 2020, a facility starts their reporting year at level 1 for their parameter NAL and additionally must comply with the parameter NEL. As mentioned before, NEL compliance does not go through the ERA process, so the facility would not be in level 1 for their parameter NEL. The compliance pathway splits for an NAL versus an NEL respectively. At the end of the reporting year, the facility finds that they meet their parameter NAL annual average concentration after implementing best management practices, also known as BMPs, from their level 1 ERA report, and after 4 reported qualifying storm events, meaning that the facility can go back to baseline for their NAL. But they exceeded the parameter NEL instantaneous maximum concentration, meaning they exceeded an effluent limitation and are in violation of the permit and are required to complete the water quality-based corrective actions. Therefore, at the beginning of the following reporting year on July 1st, 2021, the facility is at baseline status for their parameter NAL, although they exceeded the NEL in the previous reporting year. So we have talked a little bit about the exceedance implementation requirements for numeric effluent limitations. Just to reiterate, exceedances of NELs will result in permit violations and a responsible discharger must implement water quality-based corrective actions. Exceedances of NELs may result in mandatory minimum penalties, also known as MMPs. Responsible dischargers may request a time schedule order for the Regional Water Board's consideration when additional time is necessary to comply with final Tmdl specific NELs, and the requester meets the requirements found in the California Water Code. A time schedule order, also known as a TSO, is a detailed time schedule of specific actions the discharger will take to correct or prevent a violation of requirements and attain compliance with NELs. Regional Water Board approval is required to implement time schedule orders. It is important to plan early to request a TSO and to have it approved. Note that third-party citizen lawsuits may still occur when a TSO is in effect. TSOs are not applicable to NALs or TNALs. Water quality-based corrective actions are required when an NEL is exceeded. A responsible discharger should determine when one is needed, or the Regional Water Board will notify a responsible discharger when one is needed. If a responsible discharger has determined they need a water quality-based corrective action, they will need to submit it as soon as feasibly possible, as it is in the discharger's best interest to address the violation in a timely manner. If the Regional Water Board has notified a discharger that they need a water quality-based corrective action, it will need to be submitted by the due date the Regional Water Board has provided. Water quality-based corrective actions can be combined with ERA reports if it is addressing exceedances for the same parameter. However, the report may have to be submitted in SMARTS more than once.
And that means it may be that you have the exceedance response action submittal, and then there might be a different spot where you have to upload the same report for meeting your water quality-based corrective action requirements.
When water quality-based corrective actions are determined, a discharger should conduct a facility evaluation to identify pollutant sources within the facility that are associated with industrial activity and whether the best management practices, also known as BMPs, described in the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, also known as a SWIP, have been properly implemented. They should assess the facility's SWIP and its implementation to determine whether additional BMPs or SWIP implementation measures are necessary to reduce or prevent pollutants in industrial stormwater discharges to meet the applicable NELs. And they should certify and submit via SMARTS documentation based upon the above facility evaluation and assessment that additional BMPs and/or SWIP implementation measures have been identified and included in the SWIP to meet the applicable NELs, or no additional BMPs or SWIP implementation measures are required to reduce or prevent pollutants in industrial stormwater discharges to meet the applicable NELs. Mandatory minimum penalties, MMPs, apply to specific serious and chronic numeric effluent limitation violations of the permit. MMPs of $3,000 are assessed by the regional water boards for each serious violation or chronic violation. We will not be going over chronic violations in detail because they will not be as commonly encountered. MMPs are not applicable to NALs or TNALs. Internal guidance is currently under development for the MMP assessment process. So to go over serious violations, an industrial stormwater discharge parameter that exceeds an applicable NEL concentration 2 or more times in a reporting year are assessed for a serious violation. Serious violations assessed include when a parameter exceeds an applicable NEL for a Group 1 pollutant by 40% or more, or a Group 2 pollutant by 20% or more, or failure to submit ad hoc monitoring reports from a qualifying storm event within the 30 days.
And I know those graphics are a little small, but these are the actual Group 1 and Group 2 pollutants from the Clean Water Act. We didn't do this grouping. This is an existing regulation for mandatory minimum penalties. And the Group 1 pollutants are more related to total oxygen demand, solids, those kind of constituents, metals like aluminum. And then the Group 2 pollutants are different metals, inorganics, and so forth. So you'll have to go, but I just wanted you guys to know that we didn't define these groups.
So to go over chronic violations a little bit, an industrial stormwater discharge parameter exceeding an applicable NEL concentration 4 or more times within a consecutive 6 months are assessed for chronic violations. Chronic violations assessed include when a discharger violates an applicable effluent limitation. Reporting requirements will continue to be done electronically through SMARTS. Dischargers complying with the Tmdl specific requirements are ultimately responsible for identifying and reporting applicable requirement compliance. Implementation of Tmdls and SMARTS is currently under development. So we're done with going over Tmdls. Do you have any questions at this time? Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, you can take a break, I think about 15 minutes, so.
Hold on, wait for the mic. We got the webcast. You have to speak into the mic, sir. Hear me? No, on the webcast.
Oh, sorry. Well, briefly, could you go over the difference between the Group 1 and Group 2 pollutants and the reference to a 40% versus 20%?
Yes, hold on. You were asking if, to go over.
How does that apply?
How does it apply? So, say for instance, you had, for a Group 1 pollutant, you had biochemical oxygen demand. You had let's say a NEL of 0.4. If you went over 40% over that, then an MMP could apply. But it only applies if that happens twice, like from 2 QSEs.
So, yeah, so if you exceed the concentration for BOD, and then you exceed it again by 40%, that's the 40% one, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, in the same reporting year, an MMP, they'd be assessing for an MMP.
This does it refer to just the instantaneous maximum so that doesn't matter how many times you've exceeded it, just if you exceed it once, is that correct?
Once you exceed a numeric effluent limit twice, which is the definition of an exceedance, an MMP can be calculated by the regional board. And this is only for numeric effluent limits. And this is how the effluent limitation guideline compliance occurs today. If there was an NEL violated, so this is for the Tmdl NEL specified in attachment E, table E2.
For a serious violation.
Yes. Yep. Any more questions?
Oh, well, obvious. Who's going to determine the difference between serious versus chronic? What's the fine point there?
So with chronic violations, it could apply, it most likely won't happen because it happens within a 6-month period generally, 4 or more times. So because in California, we most likely won't get too many storm events within a 6-month period. It might not necessarily happen, but it just means like if you exceed the NEL, it doesn't matter the percentage.
There's a time frame, if you want to go to that slide,
Yeah, sure.
for the chronic violations. So many facilities just don't get this many samples. Mm-hmm. However, if you're a very large facility in a very wet area, maybe in Los Angeles, if there is one, you might trigger this. It's possible, but it'll be very site specific. Yeah. Any other questions in the room? Oh, well, she was waiting very patiently here.
And you may have touched on this in the beginning, but in terms of the other regions and why they didn't have any new TMDLs.
So I'll repeat the question. Why did the other regional boards not have any TMDLs? Well, they didn't develop TMDLs with industrial stormwater discharge allocations. And so they have TMDLs for other sources, but they just didn't identify industrial stormwater as a source of their impairments. So if they ever did, they would be implementing this permit in a similar manner. Yeah.
Two parts. Appendix E of the amended permit is the list of TMDLs as of what date? And then can you review what the discharges responsibilities are, if any, for TMDLs that might be adopted with industrial sources between permit cycles?
So between permit cycles, we are not reopening the permit. I call this the backlog. We had about 10 or 15 years of TMDLs that have not been implemented in this permit. And so we are actually playing catch up, trying to put these 36 in, and the board adopted the implementation requirements for those in this permit on November 6th of 2018. So this permit is proposed for reissuance probably in 2022 or around there. And then if there were additional TMDLs that are not in attachment E today, they would be added if they are new since the batch we have in there today. So it's upon our reissuance cycle that we'll be putting in new TMDL requirements that may apply. Okay, I'll go you, and then you.
3 questions. One, well, a couple. When you say watershed, referencing watershed, you're referring to the Hoc 10, is that correct?
No. The watershed is actually from the basin plan amendment. So the question Aaron had is what watershed size? And I'll get into great detail on that with the mapping tool presentation that we're going to show you today. But it's an actual specific watershed size from the TMDL. Sometimes it's a Hoc 10. Sometimes it's a blend of a bunch of Hydrologic Unit 12 code watersheds. It's a custom size from the TMDL.
If an applicable TMDL is found not to be present in the stormwater discharges, in other words, they say, well, we may have copper, but yet in every sample they take, copper is not available. Can they discontinue sampling for that, or simply because they have copper, they have to keep sampling for it even though they have no evidence of it being in the stormwater?
So if you do, and I know this permit has the list of materials and also has the pollutant source assessment and where you're actually assessing what you're discharging, they're different. So you're only required to comply with TMDLs for what's in your discharge, because TMDLs they care about what's in the receiving water, so it's actually what's in the water body. So if it's not in your discharge, you shouldn't have to comply with TMDLs for it. However, that all comes back to a good pollutant source assessment and complying with all the other required parameters in your permit.
I have a colleague who has a question. Will the MMPs be listed in SMARTs like the level 1, level 2 discharge?
Will MMPs be listed in SMARTs? We are working on putting the requirements from this amendment into SMARTs, and we're working through that. So I don't have an answer for you today. But the data for TMDL compliance will be in there just like your data is in there today through your ad hoc submittals. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you, Aaron. All right, I said you, and then who was in the back that had, okay, great.
I was just hoping you could go a little more in depth on the TSOs. I'm a little confused on the timelines there as far as when you have to submit them, or if you can get an extension, like what are those specific timelines?
So time schedule orders, it's the first time we've had to contemplate having those in this permit because it's the first time we've had state-specific numeric effluent limits. So they're site-specific, but the timelines are in the water code. So there's timelines, I don't have them with me right now, but you have to meet those certain time requirements for getting the time schedule order to the regional board for approval. So plan early because those take a while to approve if they are going to approve them. But once they are approved, they're a schedule for how you're going to comply and what you're going to do for that extension to meet a numeric effluent limit. You can find them in the water code. Pushpa, could you put that slide back up?
Yes.
Yes. So California Water Code Section 13300 and 13385. It kind of depends on the request, but I know that if they're going to be longer than a year, it'll be difficult in this permit if you're asking for more than a year. Yes. Other questions on the web?
Thank you. This is perhaps speculative, but do you envision the potential for TMDL limits and implementation dates that were established in this cycle to change in subsequent permit cycles?
So the question is, the requirements that you've placed in this permit, are they going to change? Well, they would have to change the total maximum daily load as adopted in the basin plan. So if a regional board reopened or the US EPA reopened that TMDL and changed it, we would incorporate those changes upon reissuance of this permit. Other than that, I don't think so. Any more questions?
There is one question on the web from Shannon Holbrook. Is a failure to submit ad hoc reports within 30 days in SMARTS a serious violation if it is related to a TMDL exceedance or independent of the TMDL exceedance? Yes. Is a failure to submit ad hoc reports within 30 days in SMARTS a serious violation if it is related to a TMDL exceedance or independent of the TMDL exceedance?
So if the data from that site, say the regional board goes out and does an inspection and finds all these lab reports, and that would accrue a serious violation, they just didn't submit it in SMARTS. It might be two separate violations: failure to report your monitoring and requirement data, and also you might be, if your data shows that you exceeded an NEL, it might be also a serious or chronic violation. It's a very site-specific question, but it could be multiple violations, or it could be if you submitted it in SMARTS correctly, but you didn't exceed, then there would be none, but it just depends on the situation and what's in those reports at the facility. And if there's none, if they failed to sample and there was a discharge, that's a completely separate situation. Is your mic on? Is your mic on?
Chuck White asked, when and where will the recorded version of this workshop be available?
So that's a great question. So when will the presentation be available? It will be available on our website, and we will post the slides, and we'll also post the recorded video. But we have to make these slides accessible to everyone with disabilities, and that's a new statewide requirement for state agencies. So once we get that PowerPoint completed, we will be posting as soon as we can. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start promptly in 10 minutes. So 10:24. Welcome back. Industrial permit part 3. Online permit mapping tool. Just show hands in the room. How many people have used our industrial map online? Oh my gosh, that's what? I want to say 50%, almost 50%. That's awesome. So, great. In 2018, the Industrial General Permit Map tool was created. I'm going to go through some terminology about map tools or maps in general, and when we talk about software, it gets kind of particular about the words you use. And I'll talk about why some of the information on the map may look familiar is because this isn't the first time we've had a map like this. We've had one for a few years. So Arcgis is the Geographic Information System mapping software that we use here at the State Water Board. It's not the only map software out there, it's just the product that we use. So it's a software type, like Windows or another type of, like an Apple. Federal Hydrologic Unit Code 10, it's a Hoc 10 feature. This is a federally defined watershed boundary, so you'll see that terminology when you use the map of the Hoc 10 watershed. Metadata, this is a data dictionary. So when you create online or geographic software tools or data files, you should tell people what they mean if they want to use them for their own purposes. So metadata is just giving you the information of how and why this type of data was developed. And then the map tool purpose, the reason that we updated this map, this used to be the impaired water body map for the permit. It still is, but it's also the Tmdl map now. It's because we wanted to provide the regulated industrial community the actual Tmdl watersheds from the basin plans. So we went through all the 36 Tmdls and we reproduced or found the geographic watersheds so that people who are trying to comply with Tmdls would understand where the extent is and have that information. So you can find this tool fairly easy, and I have 3 ways for you to do it. You can go to the Industrial Stormwater Program page and find the information on that page. You can go to the tool directly if you have this link. That's probably the hardest way to do it because you have to type in every single digit on this link. You can also use this picture here, and if you go to the Water Board Industrial Stormwater webpage, you click on the mapping tool text. It's like a tab on that page, and then when you open that tab, you then click on the text link there. So that's how you find it. It's publicly available. So when I talk about metadata, you can download the files yourself and use them on your own GIS or geographic information software. So whenever we develop data for the state of California, it should be publicly available because we're a state agency. So if you want to take these files that we've developed and use them for your own purposes, you can do that. You go to the FTP Water Board site on the link on the website. The link on the slide. And then you log into the shared file site using the user ID GIS shared and the password GIS download. I hope they don't change this because I depend on it being consistent. And then you go to a folder called IGP, and then you just download the files. They're in a zip file, and it has some README information, so it's all there for you to use. Also, if you're like, well, I don't really want to download the files, I just kind of want to know how you developed it while I'm using your map, you can do that as well. And there's a thing I'll show you later called the layer list. And when you go to the layer list, if you click on any of the layers of data in the map and you right click on the description, it'll pop up the metadata in a web format for you. So if you're like, why did they put this layer on here? What is this? All the latitude and longitude information, what kind of spatial extent was used, that's all in the metadata there. So when you go to the link to the map, this is what it looks like. And one of the things that was included in the update was ArcGIS Online. It changes daily, it feels like. So they added this new functionality called a story map. And so the text that you see on there is this story, and it kind of explains how to use the map. And then at the end, it populates a picture or an actual live PDF of attachment E. So after you've read about how to use the map, it opens attachment E for you so that you can read more about TMDLs. We added some additional functionality. So use the home scroll. I'll show you that in a little bit. There's also, I'll talk about the layer list and the legend, and I'll talk about all these tools up here on the top of the screen that help you navigate the map. And then if you've done all that, you can just say on the bottom here, it says link to view the standalone map, and then you don't have to read the story every time. So in a better zoomed in picture, I'll talk about the find address or place and the print functionality and what that little window looks like and how do you navigate through the map. So one really cool thing about online maps is that you can put in your own latitude and longitude or address, and it'll zoom right to that, and it'll show you things that are related around that point of interest, basically. And I'll show you how that works for TMDLs. You can print your current view of the map. That's what the print icon is. You can add on your own computer some data that you'd like to overlay with our features. It's kind of a temporary use. And then you can also change the base map. Right now we have kind of a light topographic map on there. You can change it to aerial imagery. You can change it to whatever you'd like that's built into the base maps there. If you zoom in really, really close and you're like, well, I'm really lost in this map, you can always hit home and it'll go back to the whole state of California view. You can also plus and minus to view, zoom in and out, or you can scroll with your mouse if you have the little middle scroll, or I'm sure with Apples you have a different functionality too. The legend and layer list, they're two really key points of the map. The legend, it shows you what the symbols on the map mean and what layers they're describing. So for example, the notices of intent are blue dots, and I'll go into that in more detail. And then the layer list is really cool because you can turn information on or off, and you can also look at, there's also things like setting transparency. There's a lot of functionality that you as the user can set when you look at the layers. So another basic function of this online map is this concept of a pop-up. So it's a feature pop-up. So anytime you click on a feature on the map, which is like a polygon, a line, or a point, it has a pop-up that shows up that it displays information to you about what that point or line or polygon means. And as you select different things, different pop-ups will show up. So it shows you exactly what you're selecting, and then if you click on the little arrows, it'll say 1 or 2, 1 of 5. It'll show you what's related geographically to what you've selected. So say you select a line from a river, it'll also show you the Hoc 10 around it. It'll also show you the watershed for a Tmdl if that's there, and it might also show you other water bodies that are connected. If you go to zoom to, and then you can also zoom right to the point you've selected, and then if you click on the little ellipses of the pop-up, you can pan around, you can add, you can like save a point, and then you can also just view the entire data table, which is called an attribute table. So it'll just pop up, it'll just pop up right under your screen. It'll show you what you've selected, and then it'll be right there for you. So get familiar with pop-ups, they matter, and I'll show you why they matter in a little bit. I wanted to show you what each of the layers looks like from the legend. So I mentioned the layer list and the legend. These are the features that you see in the map and what the symbols mean. So for the TMDLs, these are the ones that we've added. And so they're these really, really bright, bold polygons. These are the TMDL polygons that are related to this amended permit. Let me see. And then these pink and red lines, those are the impaired water bodies applicable in this permit. And then the dots are the industrial facilities. We don't update those every, they're not real time. I update them every about 2 years, but it gives you an assessment for density of how many industrial facilities are around a certain area or not. The data, it changes every day as facilities close their permits or open permits, so. I think what else. And then the Hoc 10, Hydrologic Unit Code 10 water body or polygons for the watersheds are still on here because industrial facilities use those to identify impaired pollutants that may apply to their site. Okay, so a little bit more about the purpose of the map. This map tool is designed to orient a facility around potentially applicable TMDL watersheds, it cannot tell a facility if the TMDL applies. That is so important. Do not use this tool and say, oh, you're in this watershed, this TMDL applies to you, now you have numeric effluent limits. That's not how it works. You use this map to figure out which TMDLs may apply, and then you go and use attachment E, because as Pushpa put out there, it's based on where you discharge, how the TMDL required you to assess that discharge for very specific pollutants. And that's all in attachment E. We didn't put those requirements hardwired into the map because we knew people would just look at the map, write down what they thought was applicable, and start doing it. There's a little bit of a assessment there that has to happen first. So we'll go through some examples, and these are similar to the ones Pushpa showed, but it's using the map. So for example, a discharger must know the following to determine applicability of a TMDL. So a discharger who has a facility in Petaluma, California, and the receiving water is Sonoma Creek. So how you'd use this on the map is you'd either put in the latitude and longitude of the facility, you put in the address of the facility, and then you hit search. The map's going to zoom right to the facility. It's going to show you what's around it based on that selection, and you can see that very light blue line. That's because it highlighted the Sonoma Creek Sediment TMDL watershed. So the map is going to tell you, hey, this facility's in the Sonoma Creek Sediment TMDL watershed, and then you should go look at attachment E to figure out what to do next. So what you do is you go to attachment E, and here it says the Sonoma Creek Sediment TMDL. Let me see what the next one is. Yeah. And then you look at the extent of it. It's the whole watershed. What is the pollutant sediment? Well, all industrial facilities with a notice of intent have to sample for sediment. So the pollutant applies. What do they have to do? Any new action levels? No. What do they have to do? Comply with the permit. By when? July 1st of 2020. Okay. So that's what they would do. And they might update their stormwater pollution prevention plan to identify that they did this analysis. So another example that's a little more complicated is when the discharger's facility is in Santa Monica, California, and their receiving water that they know is the Santa Monica Canyon. And it's a specific reach of this Santa Monica Canyon River. So what they do is that when they click on that receiving water, it's going to show them information about that impaired water body. It's impaired for E. coli, Enterococcus, metals, and lead. Then what it's also going to do, if you click on the pop-up and you click on the little arrow that's related to the pop-up, is it's going to go through any other features that are related to that selection. And then in this case, it's the Santa Monica Bay debris TMDL, so that pop-up will show up. And it'll also show the Santa Monica Bay DDT and PCB TMDL. So say you just stopped there, you would think that all of this applied to the facility, but that's not how it works. So what you'd have to do is write down or take a screenshot of these pop-ups like I did and say, okay, what does attachment E tell me? So you take that information and you go to the Santa Monica Bay DDT and PCBs TMDL and the Santa Monica Bay debris TMDL. And then you say, okay, well, what's the impaired water body? In this case, I don't see anything about Santa Monica Canyon. So it's only direct discharges into Santa Monica Bay, or through MS4 that discharges to Santa Monica Bay. So this TMDL may not apply. That's correct, because this is not a watershed-based TMDL, it's a direct discharge one. Then you'd also say, well, say it was a watershed, what about my pollutants? And you'd only have to be complying with this TMDL if you were sampling for DDT, PCBs, and or plastic pellets. Then you would look at what the applicable requirements are after you've done that whole assessment of being a responsible discharger. So that's it for the map tool. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you. Hold on, we're getting the mic. Thanks for you guys on the web.
Two questions. When a facility has an NOT approved, are they taken off the map at the next update?
So I'll repeat the question. When you get a notice of termination, are they taken off of this map at the next update? Yes. I only display facilities with active notices of intent, no exposure certifications, submitted notices of non-applicability, and active Region 8 scrap metal permit facilities.
So then between updates, the pop-up that comes up when you put the cursor on the facility,
Yes.
is that real-time information? In other words, if it's an NOT facility that hasn't been removed yet, will it pop up and show current smarts information?
It doesn't, and that's in the metadata. I'm very clear about the purpose of the industrial points on the facility and how often they're updated, and to not use this map for real-time enforcement or inspections, or because it's not real-time. We're working on that, but it's a snapshot.
Any other questions?
So if you find that your point's not on the map, you'd put the address in the search bar and have to search for it that way.
So going back to that slide with the Santa Monica,
Sure.
so you're saying if you don't discharge directly to that sensitive water body, you don't have to be in compliance?
Well, you have to comply with the permit, but the new TMDL requirements don't. If your discharge goes into Santa Monica Canyon water body, it's not a direct discharge into Santa Monica Bay. And this TMDL was written to address direct discharges to Santa Monica Bay or discharges to MS4 directly to Santa Monica Bay.
Okay.
That's what it means when only the water body is listed. If it applied to the watershed, it would say Santa Monica Bay watershed or Santa Monica Bay and tributaries.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If we find the map tool really useful and like to use it in a document, are we allowed to do that, or just give you credit on there, or do we need to get some sort of specialized permission?
It is public information. The only thing I would ask is when you use this, do not cite that we created your content. So the use of the water board logo or saying that you collaborated and that the water board created this presentation of yours, that's what we would like to avoid. This is all free information.
But we should cite where the information came from.
I would definitely cite any research. I mean, when I use information from other states, I cite it so that people can find
Just give
the
credit
source.
where credit's due. Say, hey, this
Yeah.
map came from here.
But there's no special credit from a state aid. It's just a credit of where'd you get the information, cite your work.
Yeah, okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
it's all free, public.
Any other questions on the mapping tool?
Okay. And if there's questions on the web, we'll get them at the end of the presentation, the next presentation. All right, our last topic of the day, and then we can take any questions you'd like, is the compliance options to incentivize stormwater capture and use. How many people in the room have heard about these? Oh, you guys are good. I'm impressed. Okay. So as part of the 2018 amendment to this permit, the State Water Board adopted these additional compliance options. These are not the only compliance options for the permit. So I'm going to go over what these options are, and then I'm going to go over the on-site option in particular and the off-site option in particular. And those are what we call them. It's one occurs on the site and one occurs off-site, off the industrial facility. So, and this is for both of those options. So keep in mind, this amended permit goes into effect July 1st of 2020. So naturally, these options won't really be fully implementable until on or after that date. But you can start planning for them. This new attachment I is where you'll find the compliance options, and it includes 2 additional pathways for facilities to demonstrate compliance for this permit. So I've heard a few things. These are not the only options. They're additional, and they apply statewide. So regardless of you having new TMDL requirements or not, these are an option for you for complying with the permit. And the reason that these options were created the way that they were is because of the water supply in California. And so these are volume-based incentives. So they're very large capture and use types of best management practices. Some may be infiltration, some may be diverting to your publicly owned treatment works, some may be having large tank systems and you're holding it on site for reusing in your process water. So whatever you do, if you keep a certain volume of water on your site or don't discharge it, this may be an option for you. So for both of the these new tracks for compliance, you have to design and the BMPs to capture and use the daily 85th percentile 24-hour storm event volume of industrial stormwater and authorized non-storm water. This is not allowing you to mix it with your wastewater or your process water. That's a different type of NPDES permit. So nothing has changed for the types of water that you can put into those BMPs. It's industrial stormwater and or your authorized non-stormwater discharges as authorized by this permit. The reason that you don't see incentives for treatment controls, so where you do flow through treatment, so your stormwater is discharging but you're treating it down to a lower level, is that does not enhance water supply. And so for both of the options, there is a volume-based equivalency in this design. You also have to comply with applicable groundwater protection requirements. These groundwater protection requirements only apply as in the specificity that I'm going to show you to these compliance options. So this doesn't mean for all of the industrial facility groundwater type of infiltration BMPs that these standards apply to those. It's only if you're going for a compliance option. So some industrial facilities have already started planning and for the potential of putting in one of these on-site or off-site best management practices. And so if you're in a level 2 status and you're looking to stop exceeding numeric action levels, this may be where you're at, where you've done everything you can. Maybe you're going to go for one of these options. And so we sent a letter, I think it was in 2017, letting level 2 facilities know that this was an option for them to start planning in their exceedance reporting. But either way, dischargers with implemented and operational BMPs meeting the applicable attachment I criteria are deemed in compliance with the permit's discharge prohibitions, numeric action levels and exceedance response action process, effluent limitations, and receiving water limitations that apply to the facility. For example, TMDLs. And one thing I'd like to note is even if you're not in a TMDL area, if you have other receiving water limits from your basin plan that apply to your industrial discharge, this may still be a good fit for you if you wanted to use this as a compliance track. And these are from the attachment I, these 4 bullets. I just annotated them a little bit. So for both of the types of options, for the on-site and or the off-site, you must comply with very specific discharge prohibitions like best management practice cleaning water that can't be infiltrated, that has to be diverted or taken somewhere else for disposal. Groundwater quality objectives, you have to comply with those with one of these compliance options. And then there's specific provisions I'll go over called Table B that prevent groundwater degradation. It's a list of constituents of concern that may be in industrial stormwater. Any local ordinances for the design and implementation of the BMP must be complied with. This is not to skirt local jurisdiction. If you're complying with the on-site or off-site compliance option, you must still comply with your minimum BMP implementation in the general permit because we view that as a source control to minimize a large amount of pollutants going into your BMP. So it's part of your treatment train for this permit. So you'd have your minimum BMPs, your any necessary pre-treatment to protect the BMP, and then you'd be doing the actual BMP itself. And then in general, the BMP design requirements in attachment I are protective to meet the standards above. So this is what table B looks like, and I'm going to read word for word what the permit says. So the permit states, dischargers must prevent the constituents in table B from causing a threat to the attainment of the groundwater's beneficial uses if identified and have the potential to discharge to groundwater. So this table is not saying sample for all this and you have it. It requires the discharger and their professional engineers to evaluate the potential for one or more of these pollutants to discharge to groundwater and cause a threat to attainment of beneficial uses. So it's an analysis, it's an assessment. So that's it for things that apply to both of the options. Now we're going to get into the specific on-site compliance option requirements. So the on-site compliance option requirements, here's an example here. It's where an industrial facility on their property would put in a very large infiltration gallery, and that's what this picture is of. And so and it meets the standards for the on-site. So it's actually at the industrial facility. The industrial facility would have to install best management practices designed to capture and use the daily 85th percentile 24-hour storm event volume of industrial stormwater and authorized non-stormwater discharges. So with this, this does not replace, well, it exceeds the current design storm standards in the permit because it's the 24-hour volume. It's not just the 85th percentile 24-hour, it's the daily volume. So it takes into account days of a storm in series. So it's a lot of water. It's not just the first flush. It's every time you have an 85th percentile volume, you have to capture it and not discharge it to the receiving water. It also requires a 24-hour drawdown time. And if you look at the design storm standards in the permit before the amendment, it didn't specify a drawdown time. So every 24 hours, you have to have availability and space in those BMPs to take on the next 85th percentile size. So that size of a volume. Dischargers looking to do one of these on-site will have to have a California licensed professional civil engineer to help them design and develop the BMP, to operate and maintain the BMP potentially, and also develop the plan to maintain and operate the BMP, and certify that the BMP is designed to be protective of beneficial uses and objectives for groundwater. And that really applies to infiltration BMPs. So the BMPs also have to be designed to have a shutoff mechanism or an equivalent, and this is in case you have a truck of chemical spill and it goes directly into your BMP, it's going to infiltrate right into the groundwater potentially. You have to have a plan for that or a shutoff mechanism. And then in SMARTS, we're going to be putting in some specific design and monitoring requirements for these BMPs. So there's specific reporting and design fields that are in the attachment I. So when you're going to be implementing one of these on-site options, you'll have to give us a little information about what BMP you've selected or BMPs, and then there might be infiltration monitoring that you're going to provide us. But it's very site specific. So in addition to those other benefits of doing one of these, so for compliance in this permit, an on-site compliance option BMP and the discharger that installed it are exempt from the following requirements: discharges to ocean waters, training qualifications to obtain a qualified industrial stormwater practitioner, and I'd add also maintaining one. You don't have to have a QUISP anymore. Implementing advanced BMPs. These on-site compliance option BMPs are beyond advanced. And then treatment control BMP design storm standards. These standards supersede, they're far more stringent than the current treatment control standards. And then the exceedance response actions, you don't have to comply with those anymore. So we're the on-site, if you're doing infiltration, it's the more complicated of the options. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the monitoring requirements for infiltration BMPs when it comes to the on-site option. So there's a term influent, and when I say influent, I mean the water going into the BMP, and effluent is the water leaving the BMP. And then when you have an infiltration BMP, in this case where it's a basin and it's online, it's designed to have the stormwater percolate into the soil, the vadose zone. And so to comply with the on-site compliance option when it comes to groundwater protection, you have to meet certain concentrations either at the influent to the BMP or after it's infiltrated into the vadose zone. And one way that people may do that, if they choose if they don't do the influent type of analysis, they'd be doing something like lysimeter monitoring, where they have actual little wells and they sample the water that they've infiltrated. And I will say again that the only type of discharge you're allowed if you're doing the compliance option is a volume over the 85th percentile volume. You have to capture like say your 85th percentile is 1.25 inch storm, the volume that creates, every time that volume's created, you have to capture it. So for non-dry well BMPs is what I just showed you. So like an online basin, you have to comply either at the influent to the BMP or in the vadose zone monitoring. You have to comply with maximum contaminant levels, which are drinking water standards. And then and it's nice with the basins, you have an option there, and I'll show you what happens with dry wells. So, and you also have to consider those table B constituents that I showed you earlier in the presentation. And the MCLs I'm talking about, there's a table in attachment I that puts them out there in detail. And if you are in an area with a basin plan with different values for those constituents that protect groundwater, those could be applied instead, even if they're less stringent. So another option for infiltration, BMPs, and industrial stormwater is dry wells. And dry wells are basically, this is the EPA's definition, but they're a direct injection of a liquid into the ground or groundwater. So when you're directly injecting liquid into the ground, your chances to catch a pollutant going into there, it's limited. And so we have more stringent requirements when it comes to dry wells. Some states even prohibit them or drastically reduce these options in industrial areas. So if you're installing a dry well, you have to comply with maximum contaminant levels as the influent goes into the dry well. There's no option to monitor the infiltrated water to show that you're complying with drinking water standards. And you also have to consider the table B constituents and if they'd be impacting the groundwater through your BMP. So this is what the MCL maximum contaminant level drinking water standards table looks like in attachment I. It's called attachment or table A. And this is where it goes through the primary maximum contaminant levels, which are actually concentrations. And the secondary ones are more visual, like taste and odor, but we did select a smaller list of the secondary drinking water standards that may apply to industrial. And we're going to be using any data we get out of this to evaluate what the appropriate level of MCL applicability should be to these BMPs as we go through implementation. We'll see if anybody implements one of these. So if you're doing an on-site option, and this is starting from July 1st of 2020 when the amendment goes into effect, this is an example of how you would comply with one of those. So if you're in baseline status, but you know you have Tmdl requirements coming into play, or you have other receiving water limitations that are really stringent that you're worried about, you might choose to do one of these options. And so 3 months prior to you turning that BMP on, you have to let the regional water boards in the state know that you're looking to put one of these BMPs in. And that gives them a signal to work with you and be aware of your project. And then 7 days prior to you turning that BMP on is you have to have your updated SWIP in SMARTS and on site for review. Then you would, after that, as if the regional boards are on board with your BMP, you'd be submitting sampling results in SMARTS that relate to the type of BMP you chose. So if you're doing an infiltration basin that's a really large one to capture all that water, you might now have groundwater sampling or vadose zone sampling for us to review, or you're doing influent samples of your stormwater. And then for any bypasses of that BMP, you still have to sample and submit that data, but they are not used in comparison to compliance with action levels or any else. And then if, say, the regional board comes out and they find some deficiencies in your BMP, you'd have to do those corrections for your compliance option within 90 days, or if they give you a different date. The schedule is really similar if you're in level 1 or level 2. The only thing that changes is where you submit the information. So instead of it being 3 months prior to the initial operation of the BMP and you submit that notification in SMARTS, you submit that notification through your level reports. So if you're in level 1, July 1st, 2020 hits, you'd be putting that information when your level reports are due. And then one thing that may be a catch is say you start looking at one of these, but your level report is due within like 6 months, depends on when you decide to go this route. If you have local approvals for the BMP design before that, then you'd be submitting the information at that time. So that's on-site. So we've gone over both of them and the general requirements for both. We've gone through the on-site, and then we go through off-site. And these are very dynamic. The off-site is, because it's an agreement with a municipality or other dischargers, we don't have any examples of these yet, so the requirements are a little more vague. So basically, the off-site option is where an industrial facility can do a collaborative agreement with a municipality or other dischargers to fund an off-site BMP somewhere in the watershed. The regional board has to approve these, and they can also approve a different drawdown time for that BMP than 24 hours. So that's only available for the off-site option, so your BMPs can have a longer holding time. And then they have to also approve this agreement. So these are different than the on-site, where this has a strict approval through a regional water board process, and there's actually a 30-day public notice of your plan. Because these are basically watershed-based or regional-based BMPs. They're large infrastructure projects. And here's an example of one. I've showed this a few times, but it's the best example I've seen of where the Long Beach Airport actually installed an infiltration gallery that took Caltrans water, I believe, and other municipal water, and it was a combined stormwater system, and they funded it jointly. So it's an interesting, this would be, even though it's out the industrial property, it would still qualify as potentially an off-site because it's taking other stormwater. So it's an idea. This is what we're talking about with these off-site agreements. So what you'd have to do is an updated SWIP with a specific agreement. You'd have to be, so if you got one of these approved by the regional board, the industrial facility itself would have an updated SWIP describing this agreement and the schedule, and that would be in SMART 7 days prior to implementing the agreement. So we're imagining that these agreements will have a start date. And so this SWIP would have that information in it. You'd have in the SWIP your compliance agreement, the actual agreement from the municipality and or the other dischargers. And that would be submitted in SMARTS and on site. And the agreement implementation information attached to each annual report. So this is so as you implement the agreement, you're going to report how that's going through your annual report. So if you're a discharger and you're participating in one of these off-site agreements, I'll call them, you don't have to comply with ocean water discharge requirements. You don't have to have a QISP. You don't have to implement additional advanced BMPs. Your industrial stormwater is going to an advanced BMP off-site already, and you're exceeding the treatment control BMP design storage standards. You also don't have to do monitoring implementation plans. You don't have to do sample event visual observations, sampling and analysis of your industrial stormwater, and you don't have to comply with the exceedance response actions. So if you see this one is, you get out of a lot of the industrial permit monitoring requirements. That is because these agreements are going to specify the type of monitoring that you have to do on site prior to discharging that water to the offsite BMP. So that's all driven by the regional board and the municipality and or dischargers you're in the agreement with. So industrial facility and baseline level 1 or level 2 upon July 1st of 2020. 3 months prior to this this is our recommendation, is that you let the regional boards know you're going to be pursuing one of these off-site options. And then 7 days prior to the BMPs being in operation in the agreement, you would update your SWIP on-site and smarts. And then nothing changes with any sampling that you do prior for that agreement compliance. You still put those into smarts 30 days after getting the results from the lab. And then in the annual report, you'd be submitting your implementation information from the agreement to the state through your annual report. Do you want me to do? Yeah. Or should we do questions?
We can do, well, so we have some information, some citations that you can use. So we have our industrial stormwater page link up here, as well as a link to the amended permit. And you can find the amended permit through our industrial stormwater page. And then some information regarding sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods. We used the current to find sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods. You can use 40 CFR Part 136 to find some of these analytical test methods. ELAP certified labs, you can go to the web link there, and then there's some guidance information regarding how sufficiently sensitive test methods are used for permit applications and reporting. And then for TMDLs, some other resources we have, as Laurel had gone through the mapping tool, you can find that on our industrial stormwater webpage. And then the guidance flowchart for dischargers with TMDL requirements, you can also find that through our webpage as well. And then, thank you. And if you are not already subscribed to our stormwater industrial permit issuing Lyris, you can do so through this web link. And if you need to contact us, you can contact us through the Stormwater Help Desk. Through either you can email us or call us.
Yeah, we check the inbox. So if this is the consolidated place to send your emails, it's best to do it that way.
And yeah, we'll take any questions generally or off of compliance options as well that Laurel had just gone through.
It's for the web participants.
So going back to infiltration, whether it's on-site or off-site, that water has to be drinking water level. And what I'm thinking about is, let's say I'm in East Fresno, I've got a metal shop, and next to me is a large pond that the city maintains. Coming off my site, my parking lot of that site, before that outfall water hits that pond, that water has to be drinking water level. Is that true, or?
So it depends on what option you're going for. And that sounds more like the offsite option. So say you're going to enter into an agreement with the municipality and they say, yeah, you're going to help fund their BMP and you guys can meet the requirements for the offsite option through that BMP. So if that's the case, in that agreement, the Regional Water Board is going to approve your plan for protecting groundwater and showing that it's meeting MCLs. That's what I'm saying about the offsite, is they're a lot broader because the Regional Board is actually going to sign that they approve your agreement. So through the public process and through that agreement with the municipality and the regions, that whole compliance pathway gets fleshed out in that agreement. So it does say that you have to meet MCLs, but that and exactly how you do that is decided by the regional board and the public.
Okay, because I guess what I'm thinking is that would be somewhat of an easy, at least expensive way to do this, because let's say that pond is already treating nitrates or something from a local farm.
Yeah.
And those nitrates far exceed anything coming off my metal shop site. Now, I obviously have heavy metals or something like that, but I'm just thinking, I really don't have to kick any money in to maintain that BMP because the city's already doing it.
Well, for the city to take your industrial stormwater and for it to be a true compliance option, the regional board has to approve that that's your method of compliance. And the municipality, because if you just do that and you don't work with the municipality, you're not truly doing the offsite. So the municipality may have specific things they want you to do if they're actually taking on responsibility for your discharge. Because right now, what you have is you meet compliance at the point of discharge from your facility, not in the municipality's BMP. So you need to work with them to make sure that you can meet the criteria in this option. And then I would work with your regional board as soon as you can to make sure they're open to that kind of offsite, moving your compliance point into one of these BMPs.
Okay, I
But
guess I'm
that's a
just
very
thinking,
good example of where this might work.
Yeah.
As,
I'm thinking, I mean, I could put a bunch of straw wattles around my grade inlets on my parking lot and say, okay, every day I just go out and during the storm season, I check them if they're black versus what they look like in straw. I throw them away and put some new ones, or some sort of boom and a sock around my DIs, and I say, okay, I clean them every night before.
oh, you mean as part of your
That's going to get my
agreement?
point source before it goes into that off-site city-maintained pond.
Yeah, and that would all be outlined in your agreement.
Okay.
That the regional board takes through the public process.
Okay.
So the first step for you is to work with your city, and you both come and bring that idea to your regional board and see if they'll even entertain it.
Okay.
But the regions have all been, we're all training and they're very aware of these options, but we haven't heard where they're going to be viable or where people are really going to do them, but we're excited to see this kind of flexibility in the permit.
And then the permit, you had July 2020. Is that where I have to have something in ground working, or is that my plans already put together and it's been approved?
It's a great question. So it depends. So say you're in a Tmdl area, which Fresno is not at this time for this permit. Say you want to comply with your Tmdls and use an offsite or onsite as that compliance track as of July 1st, 2020. That means you'd have to have that all agreed and submitted prior to July 1st, 2020. Sure. So basically what's going to happen is July 1st, 2020, everybody who's been planning and doing this for the last 2 years or so, they're going to be ready to submit quickly. There's going to be another group that it's going to take time. And so what may happen to some facilities in a Tmdl watershed is while they are trying to get these up and running, if they're going to do them, they may have some exceedences of Tmdl requirements, or they might have a time schedule order with the regional board. It depends on what the facility's chosen is how they're going to comply.
Okay.
Now, outside of Tmdl areas, there's really no clock. It's just receiving water limitations apply to you until you meet and comply with these BMPs and they're installed and operational. So the timeline's a little different.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for clarification, in terms of the offsite options, does the facility's discharge physically have to be transported to the BMP that's been essentially negotiated with the regional with the regional group, or do you allow, for instance, something like a credit surplus, credit purchase type of situation where your effluent might not actually be going to this BMP, but that you are funding perhaps surplus pollutant reductions?
So the question is this a pollutant trading, or is this where the water has to go to the BMP or a series of BMPs? The water has to go to the BMP offsite. Good question. I'm going to add that.
Yeah, so question on the schedule. So if you submit your 3-month notice, and then you submit a SWIP to SMARTS 7 days before you start implementing the BMP, if you did not hear, you said something about if the regional board is on board. So scenarios, you don't hear from the regional board after you do all that stuff. After 7 days, you can start utilizing that BMP.
That's correct. You know, what?
And you're deemed in compliance.
Yes, once it's up and running and it complies with these requirements, this is intended to be how you are complying with the permit. What we want to avoid, though, is surprises. So we'd like you to work up front with the region so that they understand what you're doing. But what we don't want to have happen is the regional boards not understanding how your BMPs are working, and then they come out and have issues, but they're not supposed to take you out of those options. They're supposed to work with you to make your option come into compliance. However, if they find egregious issues where it's undersized, you really don't have one out there, they might be like, I'm sorry, you just need to comply with the permit. But we hope it's collaborative.
We have a really good question from a coworker. The 24-hour drawdown.
Yes.
Does that start, let me see exactly how they put it. Does the requirement for the compliance options triggered after the first 24 hours of the 85th percentile storm, or is it triggered at the end of the QSC, which could last multiple days?
So I'm going to read it to you because we define drawdown in the permit for these. The 24-hour drawdown time, and this was very, this was a funny part of the amendment because it took us a while to make sure everyone agreed on this definition. So this is the time to drain from full to empty when no inflows are occurring and calculated as the maximum water depth divided by the drain rate. Example, measured percolation rate or allowed sewer discharge rate, considering any relevant safety factor included by the California licensed civil engineer.
What I hear triggered, he said, with no inflow. So in other words, basically you have to wait for the storm to end before that 24-hour drawdown
Right,
clock starts.
Yes, but some people will do a continual simulation where they're actually, the BMP, it's not like the soil just starts infiltrate, it's continually doing that. So once the influence stops, though, that BMP should empty in 24 hours.
Okay.
It should be, or empty enough to take the next 80th percentile volume.
And one more quick question on offsite, and then I'm done.
This is your guys' time.
Real quick, you said that basically the agreement you have with municipality or offsite option, whatever their monitoring requirements are, if they have some sort of sampling they require, those sampling results have to be submitted on SMARTS.
Yes.
Whatever they are, whatever type of monitoring it is.
Well, for the most part, it should all fit through the ad hoc report, but
Right.
we're going to have different types of sampling. So if it's stormwater sampling, you wouldn't enter that as a QSE anymore. It would have it's probably a non-QSE because it wasn't from your industrial stormwater from your site. So we're going to have help guides on how you'd enter that type of information. We just don't know what those requirements are going to look like yet. So it's hard to answer exactly how you do it. Some of it may be uploaded. I would ask the regional board as they're approving your agreement, if they're going to approve it, how they want that information submitted. And we'll make sure that we have those tools available.
Thank you.
Yeah, but the ad hoc monitoring report, it can be used for a lot of different types of data. It's not just a stormwater. I mean, if you have a lab report, you should be able to enter it for the most part in the ad hoc report.
If you're in your industrial facilities in a level 1 for TSS,
Okay.
in a non-TMDL region,
Okay.
your stormwater already goes through a municipal system,
Okay.
like a county area. Can you get into an agreement with that municipality to cover all the offsite storage?
So if the municipality, and I won't speak for them, if they were interested in working with the industrial facility to build a BMP, it's like a combo of offsite and onsite. If that BMP can capture the 85th percentile of the industrial facility or facilities, it's possible. It just depends on if the municipality wants to do it. Because it's a legal agreement. I should say that with a big L. where the attorneys from the municipalities and the industrial facilities are working out a legal agreement of who's in compliance with what. And so it's very different. Same thing as if you have, like maybe there's an area of just industrial facilities and none of the water goes to a municipal storm conveyance. You could do an agreement without the municipality as long as, you know, you're in compliance with any applicable ordinances. It may be just a discharger to discharger agreement that the regions approve as well. We'll see. But that was something the regulated community asked for and we put it in.
Can you comment again on facilities that are in a watershed with TMDL requirements? And so for the water that might discharge above the capture requirement,
Oh, yeah.
if they're in a watershed with an NEL or a TNL, that discharge that might occur does not have to comply with the effluent limit?
That's correct. And I have, if you look at our fact sheet, it's got a lot of detail, but basically the sizing on these BMPs was modeled to be equivalent to concentration-based limit. You are reducing so much volume of industrial stormwater to the watershed that it's equivalent or more protective than meeting a concentration-based limit. It also isn't looking at treatment chemicals to meet a number. So this is a very good pathway. If you can meet the thing that's most prohibitive is the volume. When you go to talk to an engineer and you show them the standard, it's very stringent because of that drawdown time. It's not just at 85th percentile, 72-hour storm event. It's the 85th percentile, 24-hour volume every time that happens. So it's a lot of water that you're infiltrating or taking to sanitary. And the effluent is just to see, we want that data to see how these are working and how many discharges happen with this volume settled out. But they're not supposed to be used for compliance in the permit. It's just data that we need to assess how these work.
Any other questions in the audience? All right, I'll look at the...
Well, we'll do the emails afterwards, but you guys thank you for your time. This closes the public session. We'll do the emails here. If you want to come up and talk to us, we'll just be responding online. So thank you.